Sure, I'll forward it to you if you need it. Oh, really? I didn't think you could really taste it.
Real.
This was clear.
Somebody over.
I mean, no, it's not.
Did you get the superintendent update from Kathy?
I mean,
Yeah, I've got it up on my screen, so I can switch to it.
It's really great.
Hello. So we have not.
I can switch to it if you need it.
I'm calling you from the phone that's in the
The
presenter.
version I have is,
Use the one that
Janet.
Janet had, she corrected. Then there's nothing.
I've got Janet's up.
So just what Kathy changed it in. Ask her what she changed in it, because it's supposed to be ADN.
Okay, are you, is that all right? You can always mute yourself, I suppose. Okay.
Tell her we already had the other one. Oh, I know, she put that in there just to be at the end, maybe. That was just in case.
Okay.
But there should have been something else attached. Wait.
Okay, so Elisa is on the phone. She's muted.
I'm pretty sure I've seen that a couple. Yeah, this is just in case, but there should be another one coming about FEMA. Ask her if she has the latest from FEMA. But that wouldn't come till 7 o'clock.
Okay, so she doesn't need that.
No, not right now.
Okay, so then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna have this one from Janet available. And you let me know if you need it.
Hey, glad you could make it.
That's a good, hey, that's a good fundraiser. Relax. Who are we missing? Lisa is on the phone. She's on the phone. Dina? Where is it? Anyone else? Oh, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Nope. I can't count.
I always have to do that. What?
Yeah. And Dina, where's Dina?
She should be here.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's only 3:01.
2 minutes, yeah, only just 2 minutes.
Did you have a good Christmas?
I got super sick.
Oh.
Bronchitis. My computer's sick, my eyes gone. But other than
No scooters inside the building. Leave your bicycle.
I told Sandy, have him give me a ticket. Just put a speedometer on that, that's all. Just under 10.
I'm gonna take a wild guess and say you hurt your foot setting off illegal fireworks.
that should be what you
No,
share.
the family,
I'm sorry.
Monday, fell within the driveway, broke his ankle, had surgery. That's what you're saying.
That's what happened there?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Another 5.5 weeks, and then 3.5 weeks.
Well, yeah, guys, I'll fix the car, shred over.
A lot of different stories.
Well,
I understand that I still consider myself a required reporter.
Mandatory.
Oh, yes. Although it doesn't fall under the title.
After 70 years, some of those.
Celebrate.
You guys are very fit one here. That's incredible. Wow.
Thank you.
The key to not getting divorced is not getting divorced. I mean, that's all you have to do.
I mean, when people ask me, I come up and married 32 years.
It's just not all in one shot.
I mean, when someone asks you how long you've been driving, you go, well, I've been for 3 years. No.
You've just not
I got it all up. The very first car.
I mean, it's not like you did things for less mistakes. There was a
Maybe.
Central, and that was mentioned, that Reyes is gonna have to pass, so we didn't have, there's no, Western Government.
2019. All right.
Bring it, I'm excited, we're gonna be a good year. And all these parents are saying, I just told her, I said, there's 12, and there's like, I'll just say, it's just a text.
Wasn't that Howard's bed?
Oil's gonna hit me.
Oh, that was something, I was really, and the thing is when I watched it last summer, I was like, what if I said, it's like, who did I have? Literally, and it's like.
This is the 7th
And they'll let you do that, and you have to read the whole thing. Like, each city, we have to read the whole thing. If you pass it on to somebody, you just want to go back to your tax. Like, if you want deed to approve what it is, you know, the state projects, deed will approve it. It's like we have, if the voters already said what it was, if you want to take it all back, there's a process to do that, but you would go, you would pay for the whole thing yourself. Well, that would be going back to, there was no intent, we never told them. The only thing was is that violence goes up, active goes up, child abuse goes up. Not everything goes up.
Take personal responsibility, and when you get the dividends, go to the governor, and go, Governor, I want to reinvest this.
People do that, I mean, that's your.
Guess who was the first motion?
You came back and
And you know who was number two? You know who's number two?
I was in and out the whole time. You are a.
No, it's just had fun, cause I know we did not, we didn't have fun if we did. You know, and this country just, prices have crashed. Oh. As a new generation. Let's have some fun. So if you look at the county, personal contributions.
I'm calling our special session, which is January 7th, 2019. Happy New Year, everyone. And this is a special session to look at a resolution. And so what I would do is move, and I believe the resolution is in front of all of you. And for purposes of discussion and moving this forward, I would move to approve the ASD memorandum number 104, and it's to support a $4 million increase to the April 2009 bond proposal by the Anchorage Assembly for a total amount of $59,113. And this $4 million would be dedicated to Chugach and Eagle River schools. And do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, so it is now open for discussion. So I'm opening it up to board members for discussion. Yes, Mr. Holloman.
Yeah, I continue to support this idea. Obviously, we're going to make use of reimbursable funds and make use of relief from the state and federal government for earthquake relief. But I suspect in the process we may have the opportunity to do enhancements in security and structure at the same time that might not be covered by those. And I would like for the district to have the flexibility to be able to go ahead and make major expenditures that are in our best economic interest in the long run. Obviously, this doesn't mandate that the money's spent if the voters approve, but it would be there as an option.
Okay, Ms. Mitchell?
So at our last board meeting, I introduced an amendment that basically said the same thing, so I continue to support this. I think, as Mr. Holloman said, there's some opportunities coming up to hopefully have some economies for things that we might otherwise do, and Eagle River and Chugach have been hit pretty hard, so I just want to make sure we have flexibility to support that community as much as we can.
Ms. Hildy?
Thank you. I thought we already voted against this at the board meeting, so I was confused why did the assembly adjust this, and where did they get the number from? Did somebody suggest this adjustment, and why did they choose $4 million?
Well, $4 million was the amendment that we had. Assembly members were in favor of this. I was asked to ask the assembly if this was something they would support, and they said that they would if the board would go back and support the resolution. And it has been done before where the assembly has increased bond dollars before. Mr. Holloman?
While not speaking for the assembly, certainly, I'm going to say a lot of their members are aware of the fact that we're behind in terms of our capital improvements and maintenance and long-term, and an opportunity to do it right as we're going through this process just makes a lot of sense to people in the assembly that I've spoken with.
Ms. Hildy?
I mean, I don't disagree with anything I've heard here. I need to know what the $4 million is. You know, when we do a bond, we present to the voters, here's what we're using these projects for. We talked about some of the earthquake repairs when we considered this the first time, saying that we haven't had those assessments done. We don't know the true cost, and being able to go to voters and say, here's what we need to spend the money on. Otherwise, it's just kind of a vague 4 million. I guess that's my hesitation.
Ms. Mitchell?
Again, I think the idea is to provide us with flexibility, so that if there are, we know there is a lot of damage out there, so if there are situations where it makes sense to go ahead and combine earthquake damage with something else that it is going to be a lot more cost effective at that point, we have the flexibility to do that. And I think the voters understand that at this point, the timing has been pretty short. We don't have all of the the I's dotted and the T's crossed, but to wait another year and miss some of these opportunities, I think that's why we're putting this forth at this point, even though all of the details haven't been worked out yet.
And I think my concern too is the 30 million that we've taken out of reserves. We'd like for that to go back into reserves, so if we don't have to use all of that and we can use some of this other money designated for earthquake repair, I think that would be beneficial too. Ms. Elise Smith-Snelling, do you have any comments?
I guess I just wanted to throw out my support for this. I know the area schools have been under a lot of pressure, and I agree with a lot of the comments that the flexibility, the timeliness of it, being able to take care of things, over this upcoming summer, not wait another, bond cycle, I think is all useful to do. I'm hopeful, and I know that there's no guarantee that, we'll, maybe see some funds back, from FEMA or something like that, but it doesn't negate the fact that we do need to take care of our schools, and, we have a lot of damage to clean up after. So those are my 2 cents.
Okay, thank you. Any other board members? Mr. Donnelly?
Well, I'm hearing some new arguments in favor of this $4 million at this meeting that weren't articulated the last time we voted on this, so that's really helpful. It's positive that can hear some clear arguments in favor of it. I'm curious, and I'd like to hear from our finance folks, since this entire bond proposition could be used for earthquake damage, way beyond what we estimate we've actually got damage at this point of time because of the amendments that we made and were approved by bond council, so it's all flexible. So there's no question that anything out there is going to get done if it's earthquake related. So this extra $4 million is not going to make a difference in that. What it might make a difference at is allowing us to move forward with some of the other deferred maintenance that might get pushed off to a later time by the earthquake funding. So there's no question that all the earthquake damage is going to get funded under the existing bond amount. My first question is, what happens if after this $4 million is added and we get reimbursed from FEMA or the state for some of these projects that are included within the new $59 million amount? Is that what it's going to be, about 59? Will that money be offset in a way so that it wouldn't show up on people's property taxes? Or will they be paying property taxes including the amount that's refunded by FEMA or the state?
Yes. Dr. Bishop?
Madam President, I have requested Jim Anderson, George Michaelis, and Tom Roth to come forward, and they have assisted if we might. In addition to those questions, there were several other asked of administration, so we did our best to come up with what we can. And during tonight's superintendent report, there's a brief update as well on the FEMA work that we can do again. So the question to be answered is that if we take out this additional $4 million and specifically put it for earthquake and we're reimbursed, what does that look like for the taxpayers?
I wish it was a yes or no answer. This is a multi-part answer. The first thing, right now we're about 22.6 million. The bulk of that is estimated. That's from all of the projections and the not to exceed contracts that we have not received invoices for yet. What we don't know, the big unknown, is the 14 schools that architects and engineers have been.
The question, Jim, is if we pass a bond and we get reimbursed later by the federal government, will that pay the bond back and leave households undone?
The other questions are other questions we've received, but this particular question from Mr. Donnelly was, if you pass a bond and the 4 million is in there for earthquake to Eagle River, and then FEMA comes back and gives the district $4 million, can we hold our taxpayers harmless and pay that bond back?
I think we might.
That might be a question that we don't
So,
know.
if I might, and George, I'll ask you to, it is, I'll just, I'll pull it a little closer. So FEMA, right now, we're very much in the process involved with both the State of Alaska Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management on ensuring that whatever we do now in terms of costings that result from earthquake repairs, recovery, is properly documented. So we do, when that time comes, that the district would be reimbursed, and I think it's up to 75% from FEMA for any costs that are specifically related to earthquake recovery. So I think, to get to your question, Mr. Donnelly, if that 4 million is in fact spent on capital projects that are in response to the earthquake, that we would be reimbursed as a district up to 75% from the federal government. Another percentage could also be reimbursed back from the state, which again, it would be the board's discretion whether or not that reimbursement would simply go back to pay down the debt, or, you know, at the board's discretion, given the language in the current bond council, you could put that reimbursement towards something else. Thoughts on that?
So I guess the way that that I would supplement the response would be that if you got your reimbursement, which could be up to 25% from the state, 75% from the federal government on allowable expenditures, if you were to get that amount and you'd already used bond funds to make up that difference prior to getting any type of reimbursement, then the board could make a decision to use the amount reimbursed to offset and pay back bonds, okay? So it would be a debt reimbursement to what was basically approved by the voters. However, it would not cover the complete costs because there's other costs associated with selling bonds. But it would certainly cover a good bulk of it, and depending on when you got the funding from the feds, if it was a year to 2 years, which it could be, then of course you're also paying interest on that amount of money that you've borrowed. So you may not get that totally back either. But in theory, if the board did decide that they wanted to go ahead and put that money towards debt service, then I don't believe there's anything that would preclude that.
Mr. Donnelly?
Well, I'd like a moment to prepare an amendment that would set out a board intent with this, that if the $4 million was reimbursed through FEMA or the state, that the board would utilize that reimbursement to pay down existing bond debt, so that this would have a net zero impact upon, well, close to it. Obviously, there's so many variables there, but as much as possible, have a net zero impact to the property taxpayers.
Mr. Foster?
Question for the administration. Is it possible in any of the 14 schools that you're looking at the estimates on that some of those costs will not be eligible for reimbursement?
It's always possible that some of the costs will not be reimbursable.
For example, a new HVAC system that's more energy efficient as opposed to just replacing in kind. Would that be eligible, or would you need to put some of your own money in for something like that?
We had that discussion today, and like a lot of things with FEMA, it depends. When you're replacing with new technology, there's a separate tracking mechanism to be able to track for the separate technology or the newer technologies. So depending on what we find, it may very well be covered, and there may be chunks that aren't, but it's premature without getting that final par.
Right, but it would be prudent if you're managing the financial side to at least consider the possibility that some of the costs that are prudently incurred may not be reimbursable. So
It's
I think-
possible.
Yeah, and I think in that framework, I think we want to have some space available to deploy funds to those schools rather than put them in a cycle where we go back 2 or 3 years later and do some repair work or some upgrade or enhancement. While we're there, we should do the best work we can for the education program. So I want to be careful that we don't unduly limit the potential use of this money in those facilities, since we're going to be there anyway.
Ms. Hildy?
Thank you, and, I agree with the reasoning Member Foster and Member Holloman shared on making sure that we're able to use the money well. We don't want to just replace something outdated with another thing that's outdated. That makes a great deal of sense. Looking at this just a year one bond, the $4 million isn't, it makes sense to me, and wanting to have flexibility and being able to do it. My concern is the long-term aspect of it. We are trying to prepare for a multi-year bond. When I'm out in the community, I talk about it to everyone, whether they want to hear it or not. We want our community to be prepared and know what we're looking at in the long term for how we're going to invest in our capital. So I guess my concern is how will this be received by our community. I think this year, because of the earthquake, it will be received favorably, but I want to make sure in whatever we're doing, we're communicating what our long-term plan is so that they can see we do have a strategic purpose in what we're doing in reducing deferred maintenance, that our buildings are ready for the next earthquake.
I guess I would offer too that because we don't know the extent of the damage on, really what we're going to be doing with Eagle River Elementary and Gruning, and there is always that question of how much you are going to get reimbursed. I foresee that we may have to go back, depending on when those funds are available from FEMA or the state, and actually look to another capital bond to be able to start the work on those schools. Now, if we get the funds earlier, that may not be the case, but to have those schools open up in a timely manner and to be able to do what we need to do, we may have to do that and then use those funds to reimburse the bond. So I think, even though at this time I do support the $4 million, because I think it can be put to good use, I do realize that we may be coming back to our voters and asking for another bond, and possibly not just for capital improvements, but for our earthquake damaged schools, because we won't have the funds at that time to start our construction and move forward. Ms. Hildy?
I'm still a little confused on the $4 million amount and why we arrived at that amount. I remember hearing something on not bond debt retirement, but bond sales. Is it related to being under some limit on when we had our last meeting? I guess maybe I don't fully understand that.
I think it would be prudent for me to defer to Member Foster as to where the $4 million number, I know in theory where it came from, but I suspect he could articulate that clearer.
I believe the Q&A between myself and Mr. Anderson, and let's just verify it for everyone and make sure that we're still on the same page, was that if we went to 59 million bond authorization, given the bond sale pattern that you're anticipating going forward, do you believe you could continue to manage the bond sales and reimbursements so that the resulting debt service would not increase the mill rate on the taxes?
Thank you for, it's been a month. That is correct. That was the conversation we had, and the reality is we do have a lot of flexibility in managing annual bond debt in the way that we sell bonds. And so, yes, the $4 million, I certainly, between Tom and I, have that flexibility and have always had it.
Ms. Hildy?
I just was curious on George's take on the long-term aspect, how this would fit into community response.
So as you've mentioned earlier, you're in a pretty good position as far as the language on the bond as it currently states. And the reason for that, of course, is that you can use all or part of the money for the various projects that's listed on the current bond for earthquake damage replacement. So we've already mentioned on there for earthquake, damage fixes, so to speak. So if you go forward again, requesting additional money for earthquake assistance, so to speak, with the voters, then I always think that, that's a little suspect, because now we've gone to them twice to basically fix earthquake damages. So that's always suspect. However, you still have the opportunity to educate the public as to why it's necessary, just like you do every bond sale or every bond election. So, I mean, you have the opportunity there, but there's always that danger. I guess the only thing that I would just add to it, and you mentioned it very well, and that is that if you commit yourself to go ahead and repay this money based on receipts, whatever that amount is, from the state and or the federal government, then what you basically have done is you've really severely limited your ability to take care of the deferred maintenance projects that all of you collectively said are extremely important, and we really need to deal with these things. So if you make that commitment, then basically that eliminates that ability for you to be able to do that. So I just think that you ought to seriously consider that before you make your decision.
Mr. Donnelly?
Yeah, Mr. Vacalis, I'm considering proposing an amendment that would say that it's the intent of the school board that any federal or state reimbursement for this additional $4 million be used to retire this additional debt amount that we're voting on today, not the full $55 million package. Would that address your concern you just articulated?
Yes, it would, sir.
Thank you.
Ms. Hildy?
I'm just wondering, and maybe just because I don't understand from Member Donnelly, to me it seems like if we go to that 59 and you can sell where the mill rate's not effective, it seems like a zero sum for change for the taxpayers. Am I missing something?
Mr. Donnelly?
Well, since the original 54 to 55 was set based on the best guesstimates we had of how to avoid a increased property tax impact, and given that it's all complicated and not a precise science because of the variance in selling bonds times, interest rates, all those other variables that it's just difficult to calculate. My goal with a potential amendment would be to just to maintain that level of debt, so that there would be a fairly good case that there's not going to be an impact on property taxes, while providing additional funding for any necessary earthquake impacts to be addressed.
Any other, Mr. Foster?
I'm going to oppose the amendment because I think we want to keep the additional money clean and not encumbered. One more complication to add and one more complication to communicate. I think our communications challenge with this particular set of construction projects and financing complications will be already pretty challenging. And I'm not certain that adding another layer will help clarify or help us sell the bonds.
Mr. Holloman?
I keep waiting for Mr. Donnelly to introduce it so I can speak against it. But since everyone else is already doing it, I'll jump in as well. I agree with what Member Foster said. And as well, I hope what happens with this particular chunk of bond money is more along the lines of what he described, where we're into a wall, we're into a roof, we're into a heating system, to the point where we can look at it and go, wow, we could spend a little more money here and save money in the long run, but it's not going to be reimbursable because it's not a total loss. But it's an opportunity to do the wise thing for the district down the road, in which case that money is not reimbursable. If we do wind up spending it on what we think is reimbursable and the money is not, we're sort of pre-bonded in that essence. And obviously we're going to be spending money that we hope is reimbursed. I too say that I'm hoping this money goes to non-reimbursable things that are smart moves, given the amount of work. And dropping back to Member Hildy's concern, in normal times, I think the public would be very leery if we say, wow, we'd like to have $4 million in here to do stuff. We're not sure what it is, but I think everybody understands the state we're in, that we have a lot of buildings with a lot of damage. We're into them much deeper than we normally are without the kind of prep and run up that we normally have. I get a sense that the public will be as understanding as they ever are on something like this at this particular moment. As a regular practice, it wouldn't pass. It's not something you want to do year to year, but these are exceptional circumstances.
Dr. Bishop?
I know Jim Anderson has some clarity, but it's good to hear that, because as we worked even to pass the bond before earthquake, before November 30th, there was some questions about the cost of roofs. And the roofs had the additional costs other than just someone who has a construction site or building, because we do put seismic upgrades in our proposal. So when we did this also at Rest Romig, when the new IMC went in, the entire corridor was redone, because it made the most sense that if you're taking the roof off of the IMC that connects both sides of the school, there were a few classrooms there. So then those classrooms were added into the bond, but there was quite a bit of controversy over, are you doing an IMC for earthquake, or are you doing, so our pattern has been exactly that. Consequently, roofs are not $30 a square foot. They're much more, because the seismic upgrades have been placed in anything that we touch. So we have had that pattern. That is how we do work on our bonds presently. So I'm happy to hear that, Member Holloman. Thank you.
And I'd just like to add, I think those roofs that we have done that to held up quite well, didn't they?
Yeah.
Mr. Donnelly?
Did you?
Oh, I'm sorry, Jim, I'll get to you. Can I have Jim speak first, please? Thank you.
To provide clarity, Member Foster mentioned the careful tracking of the money. To be clear, if the $4 million does get approved and it's in the bond, because of federal arbitrage rules, when we sell bonds and we actually sell the money, we have 3 years to spend it. So we would have a very careful tracking mechanism for all of the money spent, where we could inform the board and the public. And I believe, as it was first brought up over a month ago, the initial concept was because right now we don't know what the other 14 schools are going to come back with in the next few weeks. So I think in terms of, will people know how we use the money? Absolutely. Every dollar of it would be tracked. So it wouldn't be a black hole where we were given $4 million of flexibility with no requirement to be held accountable for how we spend it. So, you know, that would certainly not be an issue. And I think that was probably arbitrage is what Member Foster was alluding to.
I'm sorry, Mr. Donnelly?
Thank you, Madam President. I would move that we add to the proposition, the bond proposition, in addition to the $4 million intent language that reads, it is the intent of the school board that any federal or state reimbursement for this additional $4 million in bond debt be used to retire this additional debt amount.
For purposes of discussion, I'll second.
Okay.
Thank you. Could I speak to my amendment?
Yes, you may.
As Mr. Vahalis identified, by limiting this only to the additional amount, the 4 million, we maintain maximum flexibility with the existing bond amount, the $54 to $55 million. So that some of the concerns that I think you legitimately had, Member Holloman, are addressed because it only applies to the additional 4 million and not the whole corpus of the bond proposition, because that maintains full flexibility for the entire 55 to be used either for, deferred maintenance projects or for earthquake projects or any mix of the two. Because as we might be addressing a deferred maintenance project, there's certainly money in there also that could be utilized, because in the bond, we have the flexibility to shift funds among the deferred maintenance projects also. So we've maintained the flexibility within, by far, the majority of the money to address those kinds of concerns if we wanted to utilize them as we were doing one of the specified projects to beef it up for earthquake damage or address something that made sense at that time. So I still think we've got a huge amount of flexibility to deal with that issue, because this doesn't apply to the original total amount, the 55. And I do believe that the taxpayers are very understanding of the earthquake impact and that this money may be appropriate, and that I wanted to find a way to be able to come together and do this and still have a selling point for this, going along with Mr. Foster's concern, that I think this is a positive selling point, because those individuals that might be able to articulate that the new 59 number would be adding additional debt to the taxpayers, I think it will give us a tool to say, but wait, we will fix that by doing a buyback provision when we get FEMA and state money, and thus making the bond proposition more attractive to the more fiscally conservative folks that are concerned about property taxes.
Mr. Foster.
I believe the timing allows us to go forward without putting that additional burden on the 4 million. I also believe we'll find when we go across the portfolio of schools in Eagle River that were damaged and that we get into the repairs, there will be ample opportunity to deploy that capital to enhance the education program in a timely manner. And I want to encourage us all to consider the value that we have available to us by taking advantage of this opportunity to help Eagle River's education program, because I do think there are some gaps that have been left there over the years that this could help fill in. And it's not just upgrades in HVAC systems. I think there are some of the facilities that are on the list and they just haven't worked their way to the top, but since we're there, we should take care of them. So I want to have the flexibility in that 4 million to do that for that community.
Ms. Snelling, do you have any comments?
No, my only concern with adding this language is it's not explicit, it's intent. And this is something that's going to be addressed a year or two down the line potentially, and I don't know, that this resolution, which is what's on the table right now, is the place to put any of that kind of language. It's not going to change my support for, the package overall, but I just don't know that this is the right way to go about it. But it is what it is.
Well, and I think I would have to agree that there's not a place in this resolution for it. However, it could be something the board could look as we start getting reimbursements for FEMA. I don't know, is that a possibility, Jim, as we start getting reimbursements?
It is. The other reality is if this amendment were not in it, then after we do have the final tally of all the earthquake damage, and we're preparing next year's bond package, we would be able to reduce it by $4 million or whatever the amount was. So, you know, really, a lot of reasons I'm not a politician. The reality is we will likely have a future bond.
Yeah.
And if we had access to this money to start early design phases, or tear down, or whatever it ended up being used for, we would be able to reduce the follow-on bonds by some amount.
Possibly, depending on what the costs were, I think, yeah. Any further discussion before we vote on the amendment?
Can I do wrap up?
Yes, you may.
Nobody else? To address the concern of whether this vehicle is the appropriate place to put this kind of intent language, this whole vehicle's intent language. It has no binding authority. It's just, we're just approving of a proposal that came from the assembly saying, you know, would you give us your blessing for an additional $4 million? So this whole thing's intent language. So it's clearly appropriate in this if we gave some guidelines to the assembly of how we would intend to treat this money if it got reimbursed. I really do think that this will be a valuable tool in communicating with voters regarding the total impact of the bond on property taxes. And it's a very fair promise. It's a very fair pledge that if we get the $4 million back from the feds, we're going to use that to retire that debt and not continuing it, having them pay it on their property taxes. I think that's a really fair proposal, and it makes sense, and it will be a strong selling point for these bonds.
Is there any other comments? Okay, at this time, Ms. Foster.
Board Member Donnelly, a question to see if I'm following his intent. There may be space here to get make it work. Hypothetically, if one of the projects had an HVAC system that wasn't eligible and this money went to that, let's just call it $1 million so we have a number to kick around. That wasn't reimbursed. Under your intent language, would that $1 million then be, how would you treat that? How would you look at that under your proposal?
I think it's a good question. I think that question is answered by the fact that, unlike most bonds, the additional language giving the flexibility to deal with earthquake segments make this entire bond fungible. I mean, this money can be moved around almost any way, in any way to address earthquake impacts. And it's almost a zero probability, I would say, that there's going to be less than $4 million in here towards earthquake impacts. Let me say that the other way. I doubt that non-earthquake impacts will be less than $4 million. It's going to be a much larger number, so that it's not going to hamstring us the additional costs of other things that would logically, appropriately be done at the time of the earthquake repairs.
Mr. Holloman.
My concern in saying we'll do this, and if we say we do it, I think we should do it. But the concern would go back to what Mr. Anderson described. If we get it refunded, but we're also about to go ask for another bond, given the cost and the work that has to be done to sell a bond and utilize that money, it seems like we would be engaging in a bit of an extra exercise to pay that back and then go again to ask for a bond and sell more bonds, as opposed to simply reducing the amount of the next sale. If for some reason paying that money back and then bonding again was the cheaper way to go, I think that the administration would bring that proposal to us, and we'd probably have a hard time understanding that. But that would be an option they could do. But if we do this, and somehow money that we have spent from this $4 million is perceived as being reimbursed, we leave ourselves one avenue. and that is to pay down bond debt, which may not be the best deal for the public or for the school district. So I think we are gonna have to say to the public, we're gonna make the very best use of this we can, and if it's unneeded, we won't, realizing that it's almost certainly gonna be a bigger number. That's clean and simple. There'll be people that don't believe us. That's always the case when we're trying to convince people to vote for bonds. But I think reasonable people will understand it, and I think that people that understand the complexity of the situation will consider it a more straightforward and rational statement, that we're gonna use it this way, and it may reduce future bonds, or it may save money in the long run by doing energy efficient upgrades in the course of work we're doing, or other things like that.
Mr. Donnelly?
This $40 million is not going to create that problem. The $55 million creates that problem. Because all the projects listed on there, on the existing bond, may not be done if earthquake money exceeds, takes up this gap. So this little $4 million is not going to create that problem, not be the make or break of that problem. That problem is going to exist with this entire bond proposition. Because as earthquake money is utilized in it, those deferred maintenance projects are going to drop off. And if we want those deferred maintenance projects done, we're going to have to come back and ask for more money to do them. So, but this one chunk of money is not going to create that problem. It's already before us with the flexibility that's uniquely provided with this particular bond proposition.
So, Mr. Anderson, how easy is it to separate out this $4 million if it becomes part of a bigger project in earthquake repair for one of these schools?
Well, we would make it easy by picking large project or large chunks like design or demo, and make it to where we didn't spread it out over 20 schools. So we could simplify the tracking of it by the projects we choose. And they'd be based off priorities that, quite honestly, once Tom gets the architect assessments back in the next several weeks, we'll probably all be discussing priorities and potential decisions that have to be made. So I think we would make it easy to track.
All right, is there any other discussion, questions? Ms. Mitchell?
I appreciate the intent of what you're trying to do. I think it does, for me personally, it actually complicates the communication. So I would like to keep it as simple as possible, and so I'll be voting against the amendment.
Okay, are we ready to take a vote? Okay.
You can do it online if you've got your device, or we can do a voice vote.
We can just do a voice vote if that's okay with everyone. So if you'll just call roll call and.
Andy?
No.
Voting on the amendment. The amendment.
Amendment, yes, we're voting on the amendment.
Andy was the name?
Yes.
Mark Foster?
Yes.
Star? That's it?
No.
Elisa?
No.
Dave Donnelly?
Yes.
Alicia Mildy?
No.
And Dina Mitchell?
No.
So that motion fails with 5 nays and 2 yeas. So at this time, we're ready to move on to the initial memo that's on the floor. Are there any other amendments or discussions? Yes, Mr. Foster.
I want to thank President Marset and Assemblymember Trainee for their help with this project. Thank you.
So the only other amendment that I might propose, and this was in the Anchorage School Board understands there will be a $500 fee to be paid by the district to the bond council for a change in the bond proposal language. I guess we are not sure that that's gonna be $500. It could be less, it could be more. What we can propose is that an amendment would be, the Anchorage School Board understands there will be a fee to be paid to the district, to the bond or by the district to the bond council for a change in the bond proposed language, whatever that fee may be. Do I have a second?
Second.
So just on discussion on this, I don't really know how much it's gonna be. It could be $500, it could be $300. I don't imagine it's gonna be more than that. But in support of this resolution and because it is something we're supporting, I do support covering the cost of it.
It's actually part of the resolve.
Right, but she's saying change it, don't
Right.
specify the amount because it could be more or less than 500.
Yes. Any discussion?
So,
Yes, Mr. Donnelly.
how would the actual wording of the resolution read then?
Or I think we're just taking out the 500. The Anchorage School Board understands that there will be a fee to be paid by the district to the bond council for a change in the bond proposal language.
Thank you.
I'm fine with that.
Okay, any discussion? Ms. Snelling?
I'm okay with that. I'd be a little bit better if there was like a not to exceed number, or like not to exceed 1,000 or something like that, if we have that kind of a ballpark, but, I understand that, you know, we're gonna pay it, so I just don't want it to be a crazy fee and get blindsided.
Okay, any other discussion? Okay, at this time, we'll vote on the amendment on the floor, which is Anchorage School Board understands there will be a fee to be paid by the district to the bond council for a change in the bond proposal language.
Andy Cohen?
Yes.
Mark Foster?
Yes.
Stern Offset?
Yes.
Elisa Snelling?
She probably couldn't hear you.
Elise?
Are you a yea or nay?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Dave Donnelly?
Yes.
Alicia Hildy?
Yes.
Dina Mitchell?
Yes.
Okay, that amendment passes with 7 yeas. Now to move on to the main motion, which is Memorandum 104. Is there any discussion, or are we ready to vote? Mr. Donnelly?
Thank you, Madam President. The resolution does specify that the board is asking that any additional money above the existing bond amount, the additional $4 million it's proposing to request, would be dedicated to the Chugach Eagle River schools to help them recover from the earthquake. I anticipate that there's going to be a lot more actual expenditure than $4 million, and that it's could fully be taken care of within the existing amount of money, but I also recognize that Chugach Eagle River's been hit pretty hard by this earthquake. So I just wanted to point out to people that it does say that it would be dedicated, that additional $4 million would be dedicated, but not all, would not be exclusionary. It means that $4 million would be used, but that's not a cap on the amount that's used because it's going to take a lot more than that.
Correct. Any other discussion? Okay, at this time, we're ready to vote.
Andy Cohen?
Yes.
Mark Foster?
Yes.
Stern Offset?
Yes.
Elisa Snelling?
Yes.
Dave Donnelly?
Yes.
Alicia Hildy?
No.
And Dina Mitchell?
Yes.
Okay, that motion passes with 6 yeas and 1 nay. So at this time, I'm going to take about a 15-minute break before, well, let's take about a 10-minute break before we move into work session. We adjourn.
That was first.